Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the UNSW Disability Innovation Institute's webinar on eugenics and immigration in Australia, which is presented today by Karen Soldatic. I'm Jackie Leach-Scully, Professor of Bioethics and the Director of the UNSW Disability Innovation Institute. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the Medigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the unceded land on which UNSW Kensington campus sits, and the Camaragal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I am now. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'd like to extend that acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. As we share our knowledge and practices across our communities, we also recognise the knowledge embedded within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Now, if audience members have any questions during this event, or if anyone's having any difficulty and can't use the Q&A function, please email us at diiu@unsw.edu.au. And this information is also on the slides. Closed captions have been enabled on otter.ai and via the Zoom automatic live transcription. Again, please contact us if you are unable to access them. We also have two Auslan interpreters from Sweeney Interpreters who will be on screen alongside the speakers. Audience Q&A will be conducted via the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you're on a web browser or a mobile device. So please post your questions here and they'll be passed on to the presenters during the Q&A session. Just a word about the DIIU itself. The Disability Innovation Institute is a world-first initiative. We focus on disability research, education and knowledge exchange. Our team members take pride in undertaking work that's radically inclusive and crosses disciplinary boundaries. Our approach is to see disability not as a problem to be solved, but as an integral part of the human condition, to be encountered and engaged with rather than feared. And in this light, I'm delighted to welcome you to this, the fourth in a series of events, A Past Still Present, Disability, Discrimination and Eugenics from the Nazi Third Reich to COVID-19. The aim of this series of seminars isn't simply to consider these as historical events that appear to us today as shocking, but also safely set back in a history that we can confidently say will never happen again. But we also want to consider whether this is a past that is still present. That is, whether these ideas still influence attitudes to people with disability in the contemporary world. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce to you our presenter. Karen Soldatic is a professor at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. She was awarded a Fogarty Foundation Excellence in Education Fellowship for 2006-2009, a British Academy International Fellowship in 2012, a fellowship at the Centre for Human Rights Education at Curtin University, and an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellowship. Her research on global welfare regimes builds on 20 years of experience as an international, national and state-based senior policy analyst, researcher and practitioner. She obtained her PhD in 2010 from the University of Western Australia. Karen is Istro-Romanian, the smallest ethno-linguistic minority group in Europe, formally recognised by UNESCO. Karen's research on Australian society and settler colonialism is shaped by her lived experience of being the child of immigrants and brings this to her analysis in attempting to understand Australian racialized practices of everyday life. So welcome, Karen, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Thank you for having me here today. And that really was a beautiful acknowledgement of country, and I too would like to acknowledge elders past and present, in that today I'm presenting on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd also like to thank Isabella for her incredible organisation and keeping me informed along the way about today's presentation. So thank you so much. I'm going to go to a screen share now. And one thing that I'll be doing throughout this presentation is actually reading the screens on my slides where the slide content is different to what I'm actually speaking. So half the slides will have content that is directly related to quotes that I'm using, and the other half is pictorial or in dot point form. And so I will read these as best I can as part of the presentation or in addition to as moving along. Is everyone okay for me to share? Yep, great. Okay, play from the start. Okay, so eugenics and immigration in Australia are past till present. And today's presentation is based on a paper that I had published at the end of 2020, early 2021, as part of a Canadian special issue of the Journal of Social Justice. And what I found really interesting, I was the only contributor who really brought the question of disability and eugenics to practices of migration in settler-colonial contexts, where often the eugenic frame was focused solely on racialization. And I guess that's one of the things that I found particularly interesting, that eugenics and migration has been well traversed in the settler-colonial state and across Australia and Canada. But in terms of thinking about the important role of disability in settler-colonial biopolitical population regimes, disability is rarely considered in the majority of work. So I really want to also thank Jackie for asking me to present. I'm just going to slip to the next slide now. Okay, so I actually want to dedicate today's paper to a woman called Teresa Schundi, who fled the Balkans with the rise of fascism in the interwar period, to only find herself locked in Australia's notorious institutions for by far the majority of her life. So at the time of her death, she was 61. And prior to her death, she actually died in an institution. She spent 36 years of her life across the Australian institutional network, I would suggest, due to eugenics and being a woman from the Balkans, where you're not quite white enough. So I do want to dedicate today's presentation to her, because I think it actually helps to remind us the way that immigration, gender, and particularly notions of madness are deeply inscribed in Australian settler colonialism and the possibility of its continuity in everyday life in the Australian context. Okay, so on the first slide, I have a quote from Treaties Report number 95 by Dougie Herd, and I'm going to read that out as part of the presentation. So in preparing for today's seminar discussion, I was faced with the dilemma of thinking about eugenics as an immigration policy to sustain whiteness of a particular kind, and eugenics, both its so-called positive and negative forms, as a policy designed to sustain a particular imaginary of the so-called prowess of white settler colonial able-bodied masculinities, and how eugenics actually frames key historical moments in the forming of Australia. Where to begin was the question that I worked with, especially when there are so many points of entry that offer possibility. Things around reproductive controls, which in the disability gendered area, or often referred to as feminist disability studies, is covered quite in depth. Practices of racialisation, as we know through what is known at immigration as the Australian white, the White Australia policy, and dispossession of Indigenous people based on eugenic constructs to sustain white power and settler-colonial lands. These are all grounded in the twin sets of relations commonly referred to as scientific racism and scientific ableism, the cornerstones of eugenics, which in its most extreme enunciation occurs during the Nazi interwar period. And places like Australia, as we saw in the previous dedication, really adopted many of these practices in the immigration sphere. So after a quick desktop review of publicly available material, I started filtering my searches around possible disabled Australians who will remain part of the public historical record for their roles in advancing contemporary notions of disability rights. And during this process, I stumbled upon a quote of one of our most famous adopted Australians living with disabilities, Dougie Herd. Yes, a white disabled man with incredible privilege that enables him to surmount the extensive barriers in his appeal to migrate to Australia. And I'll quote from him now from the Commonwealth of Australian Parliament Treaties Report, number 95, that was issued in 2008, where Mr. Herd was presented the case as to why Australia should ratify the UNCRPD. So not just sign, but actually ratify. In his quote, Mr. Herd states quite clearly how the privilege of whiteness, class, and masculinity, with extensive political networks, enables disability, somewhat a level of erasure around ableist norms embedded in Australia's migration policy, both in the former colonies and then in the states and territories post-Federation. And so I quote from him now, where he actually presents his case. And he says, I managed to migrate to Australia as a person with a disability, despite all of the advice I was given, that it was going to be impossible or nearly impossible. I think I was able to negotiate my way through the formal rights that I have because I am white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle class, was in a job, was confident to the point of arrogance, was a professional advocate, was trained to be someone who could negotiate their way through the mirror of legal systems that they presented, and have a 25-year history of working in the disability advocacy sector in Scotland, Europe, and now in Australia. Not everyone comes with those sets of benefits. Many people who will come, particularly from a non-English speaking background, will find it more difficult to exercise and realise their formal rights as a consequence of the secondary indirect discriminatory forces that play upon them, which is not to say that Australian law is bad or that it is inconsistent or that it is second rate, but that we simply engage with that process from our different experiences. Here Dougie Herd is talking about himself as a white middle class disabled male professional. I am more advantaged in that than others. It did not harm me as a potential migrant to find my way through a stream known as distinguished talent, of which there are only about 250 migrants a year. I'm just going to move slides now. And he continues, it did me no harm whatsoever to be working in a field so they could have a relationship with the then Premier of New South Wales and get his disability advisor to get Bob Carr to sign a letter to say that it was a good thing to bring Dougie Herd to Australia. Nor did it harm me at all to have the Premier of Scotland write a letter because I happened to go to university with him 20 odd years ago. So we can see the layers of privilege that Dougie is talking about when we think about migration and disability and his own experience. And he continues and says, and he and I shared a political background that might have something to do with students believing that they could change the world. And then he goes on and asks the question, but if you are the 13-year-old daughter of a professor of English who wants to migrate to Australia, and you happen to have cerebral pausing, you will find that you cannot do that. So unwittingly, Dougie Herd, whilst he can identify some of his position of privilege, as we note from his quote, the disabled daughter remains largely silent on issues of race, caste, class, and gender, and what this might entail for thinking through the complexity of eugenics as a governing practice of population rule, both in the past and through its practices of continuity in embedding itself down. The daughter, 13 years, is the daughter of a professor, so already a marker of privilege. Therefore, matters of status and power, class and respectability. So we can only imagine with the parent of a professor already provides a significant level of advantage beyond the many peoples who have tried to enter Australia on the grounds of race and disability. So I'm just going to now move to the next slide. The next slide says eugenics, immigration and settler-colonial population management. And on the slide, I've got a first dot point that says disability as a regulatory category around the creation of a particular form of white able-bodied settler colonialism, and works to underpin what the writer Patrick Wolfe argues is a particular racialized settler colonial logic of elimination. And Wolfe in 2006, Patrick Wolfe published a very, some people would say contentious, but a well taken up argument to separate settler colonialism and what settler colonialism is trying to do in population management. And that really is, it's immigration to really drive the logic of elimination of Australia's first people. So this is a particular argument that Patrick Wolfe talks about in terms of immigration. And I would suggest in terms of eugenics theory and thinking about disability's ongoing position in settler colonialism, that that disability is a core regulatory category in immigration regimes. So now I'm going to read back to the paper. It is well established within international literature that settler colonial societies have a complex set of governance practices that have been and remain determined by the logic of colonial power. Veracini has argued that the logic of colonial power within the settler colonial landscape is quite distinct to that of colonisation. Veracini suggests that this distinction needs to be understood as that shaped by distance and dispossession. Colonisation was shaped by its distance, a governing of faraway lands, water, species and peoples, whose resources and labour power were exploited, extracted and brought back to the centre of colonial power for colonial appropriation. Settler colonialism, however, is marked by a focus on accelerated reproductive capacity. And this is particularly important if we think about eugenics and eugenics' two dominant tiers around what's commonly referred to in eugenics literature as positive eugenics. And what they mean as positive eugenics is not that eugenics is positive, but it's really the idea that it's pro-reproduction. And then negative eugenics, which within the disability field, we write a lot when we think about and write around reproductive controls, sterilisation and so forth. As a so accelerated reproductive capacity as a distinct form of colonial power. Settler colonial seeks to dispossess its colonised territories of lands, waters and species for settlement by the coloniser. The rapid reproduction of settled humans, their animals, plant life and other species on these stolen lands is at the point at which colonial power is established. Colonial power is aimed at embedding, normalising, naturalising the settler on stolen lands and territories. The aim is to remove the presence of those who came before, the prior, the indigenine, the first, so that the presence of the settler colonial state is understood as all that has existed in place as there was nothing there before the settlers' arrival. Thus, while colonisation extracted and appropriated from the distant centre of power, settler colonialism dispossesses through direct strategies of elimination to make totally absent those who came before. Patrick Wolfe concurs with Ferencini's argument, stating that settler colonialism destroys to replace. Feminist scholars examining historical developments within settler colonialism have also suggested that this focus on settler population naturalisation, or the process of immigration, and in turn its concentration of accelerated reproduction, has meant that within the settler colony, women's reproductive capacities and sexualities have come under particular scrutiny. And Alison Bashford, the colonial historian who writes particularly about the eugenics period under the age of British Empire and the establishment of white Australia, really talks about this. She doesn't really engage with it from a disability theory perspective, but she really looks at reproductive controls within the Australian colony and how that's associated with immigration and heteronormative controls to further and embed settler colonial governance. This is done in two ways. Firstly, in terms of monitoring white women's fecundity and the spurring on of state practices to encourage white able-bodied women's reproduction. And secondly, as Indigenous queer scholar Maddie Day has argued, that the settler colonial preoccupation with population replacement is a unique form of heteronormative governance over Indigenous peoples and peoples who are considered to have inferior biologies, involving the monitoring of interracial marriages between white men and Indigenous women, and also interabled marriages between the able-bodied and the non-able-bodied or the disabled through this period of time. All this work empirically confirms Ferencini's suggestion that settler colonialism is marked by political narratives of reproductive urgency, such as in Australia, where the populated parish theme dominated in the interwar years. Combined, they suggest that this leads to a very specific form of biopolitical management in racialised immigration regimes, where disability is often hidden so that its invisibilization is not revealed to the public. Interestingly, despite the broad-scale recognition of the importance of biological reproduction for the furthering of settler colonial regimes of power on stolen territories and practices of immigration, few settler colonial scholars have considered the central importance of the category of disability. And this is where I think Jackie bringing eugenics and really developing this series is just fantastic. So thank you so much. Yet disability scholars too have often neglected to engage with critical debates on the differentiation between the distinction of settler colonialism and colonialism, and the nuances of these two different relationships of power. In both fields of scholarship, while disability is present, settler colonialism is often absent, and vice versa. So there'll be debates around settler colonialism and colonialism, but no discussion of disability. Okay, slippery definitions of disability. So on the next slide, I've got some quotes from a number of disability scholars, historical scholars. So the first one says, the forming of modern states in the age of empire thus enacted slippery definitions of disability, disease, and illness. And even though we think this is particularly important in terms of continuity in Australia's existing immigration policy and how they argue disability discrimination as quite a normative stance, because it says that it's arguing, it's positioning disability as separate from disease and illness. But actually, as we'll see later on, that's not the case at all. Definitions of, the next quote that I've got is definitions of disability through practices of immigration imposed upon both the internal population and external population social expectations of what it means to be white, able-bodied and normal, and racial and physical fitness of a particular kind. And feminists have been particularly astute in writing about this in terms of Australian masculinities and the kind of able-bodied subject that's required as part of the naturalisation of settler colonialism in Australia. I've also got on here some US scholars that have actually talked about this in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, around eugenics and the way that Black bodies intersect with disability in terms of types of value within the immigration and slave trade regimes in the transatlantic, and Holly Caldwell, who's written extensively on US modernizing states. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the paper now. So I'm not the only one to argue this within the settler colonial context. For example, the North American context, the work of Caldwell in the area of deafness, the work of Stephanie Kennedy in the transatlantic slave trade, all demonstrate this to be a case of white able-bodied settler colonization with the modernizing state. And Tanya Tykocki at the University of Toronto continues to argue that this has increasingly shifted to the area of global mental health as a form of immigrant screening, not dissimilar to that work of China Mills, who examines the creation of notions of global mental health as a type of racist eugenics scientific ableism, a modernizing of the eugenics understanding of deviants, bodies and minds. So the analytical juncture in this paper actually also responds to the work of Chatterjee, who has consistently argued for greater depth to our analysis of identifying, locating systems of racialized power within settler colonial states and its immigration system, alongside addressing the tensions raised by Canadian scholar Rachel Gorman's critical work on the dominant narratives of disability, and the need to be explicit about biopolitical practices within immigration regimes that sit at the intersection of ableism and racism, but represent a continuity of contemporary forms of eugenic science. Through its circular mobilisation across, through and within different settler colonial biopolitical instruments of power, disability can be seen as circular, both as a eugenic concept for containing, moving and invisibilising settler colonial regimes of power and impact, and also as it wraps around divergent political techniques of governance in managing immigrant bodies and minds, and the ways in which immigrant regimes are generative of impairment in and of itself. Thus, disability as a circular concept through eugenic structures of power always traverse the tensions between ableism, disableism, discrimination, and that of race, and the normalisation of so-called white productive power. Just wondering how I'm going for time. Okay, so what I've got up on the screen now is I've got, and those who know my work in this area know that I always like to come back to this. So I've got the slide divided into two halves. On one side, on the left-hand side, I've got disability in Australian immigration, 1901, and then I've got a short text that says, as per US settler colonial context, definitions of disability move between disability, disease and illness, as I stated before. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, facing the screen, is I've got the first page of the disability, of the Immigration Restriction Act, number 17. And what's really interesting, partly representative of the time, but also to show the dominance of notions of eugenics and the fit, able-bodied white subject to settler colonialism, whilst Australia's immigration was really known across the world as as a white immigration policy. Interestingly, what it used was disability as a way to screen out, bodies of colour, non-white bodies in the process. And if we come, so the Act, it has the assent date of 23rd December 1901. Then it has the short title where it says this Act may be cited as the Immigration Restriction Act. Then it has the definition as it appears. Then it has Section 3, which is prohibited immigrants. And within Section 3, what we see is the aspect around language. So Section 3A talks about the dictation test. And actually, you can get access to people who were, to the files now of people who were excluded based on the dictation test and were sent home, were unable to enter. So you can actually get access to those files online now. They're readily available. Then it says, interestingly, Section B, it actually talks about the opinion of the minister of someone who would become reliant on a charitable institution. And this is really important because if we think about current immigration regime, we'll actually see later down the track in today's presentation that, you know, the whole notion of being dependent upon the state and the cost of the possibility of how much you might cost the state or charitable institution is the core justification now to exclude people with disabilities. Section 3C clearly states, and I apologise for the language, but we have to remember this is the language of the time, any idiot and insane person. Question 3D, it thinks about bodies in terms of disease. We can see this coming through in immigration in COVID, where we had a border shutdown, so the original immigration 3D clearly states any person suffering from an infectious or contagious disease of a loathsome character or dangerous character. So that combination of disease and character, here it is combined as well. And then E, criminalization, any person who has within 3 years been convicted of an offence, not being a mere political offence, but sentenced to imprisonment. So, I mean, that's interesting, that distinction between being a political dissident, even within Australia, versus other kinds of criminal offences. And I'm not sure what that is in Australia, but I think actually the political offence would be quite different now if we think of recent cases there. But we can actually see the way in which constructs of eugenic notions of disability and impairment are deeply embedded as the framework to exclude people within the Australian settler state. Okay, so I'm now moving to the next slide. And on the next slide, I have as the title, Disability, Immigration and Australian Exceptionality. I have 3 dot points. I have movement of people across borders is unprecedented in contemporary times. And then the second point I have, by 2019, the number of people on the move surpassed that occurring in World War II. And then the third point I have is from a colleague of mine, Nicola Burns, and work she's doing with the International Organisation of Migration that is examining the Missing Migrants projects, which records in real time the number of migrants who've been lost or disappeared on their journeys. Is just under 50,000 migrants since 2014. And that figure is taken from June 2022. So settler-colonial Australia has been at the forefront of highly racialised immigration population management regimes. Its national classificatory logic of inclusive citizenship is grounded not only in European invasion, but it's also its formation as a nation with its constitutional framing in 1901. Internal population regimes to address settler colonial anxieties of securitization are coupled with the biopolitical management of immigrant flows at the border. And the presence of disability, disease, and potential death circulates through immigrant governance regimes in interrelated processes. Disability has a relationality between the immigrant body and mind and the Indigenous peoples within the settler colony of Australia. Disability has been mobilised in the settler colonial state at key historical moments, extending beyond the original strategy of externalising disability at the border through closing down territorial borders to, when possible, as marked out in the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. White colonial settlers imagined the body politic of the nation as not only white, but also as able-bodied. So while the Constitution denies the presence of Australia's Indigenous peoples, the Immigration Restriction Act explicitly included the disabled immigrant at the nation's border. This act, the foundation of white Australian policy, is internationally known for its racialisation of border control. However, lesser known is its marking out of disability with the explicit exclusion of, as I quoted earlier, directly from the Act, and I apologise for the language, any idiot or insane person, or any person suffering from an infectious or contagious disease of a loathsome or dangerous character. And I always find that interesting that we combine those two together, as we still often do, as we'll come to later in the presentation. The disabled immigrant was central to white settler colonial discursive positionings that situated whiteness as biological purity, free from disease, illness, and disability. The visibility of disability operated as an underlying logic of a moral political imaginary of a new nation that explicitly cleansed itself from its past. The formation of a white Australia as a national body was a confluence of borders and public health measures, as well as establishing notions of the fit, able-bodied person. This becomes particularly evident with the passage of the Disability Discrimination Act in 1992, while reforms to the Migration Act in 1958, which replaced the visible racialisation of Australia's settler colonial border regime of 1901. The 1958 Act remains the only piece of legislation exempt from the Disability Discrimination Act. Disability's place of exceptionality is, however, not without temporal significance. The Disability Discrimination Act, established in 1992, is the same year as Australia introduced mandatory detention policy for so-called unregulated migrants. Disability presence thus works in tandem with and circles back to settler colonial anxieties to secure the borders that really have never belonged to them. In line with Baker's historical account of disability within settler colonial education policy, disability is hunted for in multiple ways to ensure that it is excluded as part of a modernising settler colonial state. Okay, what I've got on the screen now are some recent submissions to the Disability Royal Commission that is explicitly looking at the way that disability is governed and regulated in Australian immigration regime, and particularly thinking about the role of detention and offshore detention. So what I've got is on the screen is the most recent from the Refugee Council of Australia, dated May 2022. And it's actually looking at the average length of detention recorded at the time of August 2021. And the average length of detention was 696 days. Now, the same report goes on to argue that in every other settler colonial state, so the US, New Zealand, and the US, actually the length of detention has diminished, and in the UK it continued to decline even throughout COVID. So Australia has maintained this, not just maintained, increased levels of incarceration of refugees in offshore detention. So despite the global displacement of vast numbers of people, numerous nation states are closing down their borders to refugees. No more than ever, there is a global presence of harsh policies of mandatory incarceration, both on and offshore and at the fringes of borders. The incarceration of immigrant bodies and minds, young and old, offers a level of visibility through the strategic intent that is to make invisible new migrant arrivals. It is the very nation states that have ratified the UN Convention of Refugees, such as Australia, that have established some of the harshest regimes of indefinite incarceration. The massive increase in indefinite incarceration centres around normalised immigration spaces, removing them from the geopolitics of territory. While bodies and minds, peoples and communities incarcerated inside detention centres disappear from our memories, and the symbols of possible rejection, despair and exclusion are fenced in, so we cannot see, all on the proviso of a geopolitics of deterrence. The detrimental impacts of mandatory incarceration illustrates Connell's proposition surrounding the ontoformative effects on bodies embroiled in relations of settler-colonial power. As well documented in the media and in scholarly research, going offshore incarceration generates severe harm, distress and disablement in promoting immeasurable suffering. The temporality of indefinite incarceration creates newly formed ontoformative vulnerabilities around mental illness and suicidality, and expounds many of the vulnerabilities that one's mobility had hoped to avoid, involving the destruction of bodies, minds, and spirits. Hope is displaced by despair, desperation with enduring forms of intolerable suffering that make visible presence of distress, disability, and death a pernicious practice of state-generated power. The erasure of asylum seekers and refugees from the settler-colonial imaginary has been actively sought through the banishment of racialised bodies and minds offshore, through offshore excising from Australian territory. Okay, so I'm going to come to the next slide now, which says disability, criminality, and Australian immigration regime. And here is something else that I'm pulling out, quoting from the Sydney Centre for International Law, which is specifically looking at the aspect of, again, another submission to the Royal Commission, Disability Royal Commission. And there's quite a number of really well-researched papers around the law and around lived experience, what this all actually means for people with disabilities who are trying to migrate. So in terms, I've got two quotes, and both of them actually really bring out not just this aspect of racialisation in Australian disability regimes, but the aspect of criminalisation and its continuity in Australian governing structures. So the first quote that I've pulled out from the Sydney Centre for International Law is: a person will not pass the character test. So, you know, exactly as 1901, if the person has a substantial criminal record. And as it says, this includes circumstances where the person has been found by the court to be not be fit to plead, or has been acquitted of an offence on the grounds of unsoundness of mind or insanity. So here we see how eugenics logics are getting played out through practices of criminalisation, but also to expel disabled immigrants from Australian territory. And then there's another quote in the next page that I pulled out that says the minister has even conceded that, you know, for some people, So in this one particular case, that his violent and dangerous acts resulted directly or indirectly from his mental illness, which were exasperated by the detention environment. So the ways in which Australian immigration regimes actually bring on aspects of mental illness as defined in terms of the immigration detention centre that leads to practices of criminalisation. So reinforcing genetic notions of the able-bodied fit immigrant and the kinds of settler-colonial subject that it's prepared to bring into the borders. 5 minutes of presentation left. Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm just going to move to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide says settler-colonial logics refusing disability. So the first point that I talk about there is Disability Discrimination Act. It was established simultaneously with onshore detention centres. So the beginning of onshore detention centres in Australia. Australia's Immigration Act 1958 is still the only act to be exempt from the Disability Discrimination Act. No other act is. And the Australian Health Test in the Immigration Act, actually, the existing act monitorizes disability through quantifiable statistical measures, which are really grounded in the very historical logics of statistical inferiority embedded in eugenics. So there's this incredible continuity of even how notions of bodies of value are calculated within within the existing Immigration Act to exclude people with disabilities. And then to finish, really what I'm arguing, as my colleague Nicola Burns has argued, is what we really need to think about is the relation, what eugenics actually enables us to do is to think about the continuity of disability, immigration and colonialism or colonization. With the invasion of Australia as part of the British imperial conquest and expansion. And Nicola Burns argues a key aspect of post/decolonial writing is the recognition of the racialization of those subject to colonial rule with a view to the scientific eugenicist underpinning of racist colonial practices and its enduring impact on immigration law and policy in the present. The intersectionality of race and disability has been the subject of ongoing debate and discussion amongst scholars working at the interstices of disciplines, mapping the past and present efforts to render disabled people immobile. So really what Australian immigration policy is the way that it utilises disability. It utilises disability as a core governing concept to not only exclude and immobilise disabled people's movement across borders, but also as a way to devalue non-white bodies in the immigration process. So to be able to stratify the kinds of white able-bodied citizens that it desires to have settle on the Australian, within the Australian settler colonial state. And I just really, so this up the top here, I've got a media article from a project that I've been working on around thinking about institutions in the area that at Western Sydney. And the media is, it's a very old media piece from the 50s, and it says mental patients used as slaves. And it talks, it's a little clip, and it talks about how at Rydalmere Mental Hospital, many of the patients were basically not paid at all. And then I've got another slide down the bottom where it's a recent article in April 2022 where it says fears of modern slavery will increase as temporary migration resumes. So, you know, the ways in which labour is a critical component of the eugenics enterprise in settler colonial Australia. All right, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm really sorry for being over time.
No problem with being over time, Karen. Thank you so much for that. It's really fascinating presentation, particularly, I think, underlining one of the themes of this series of seminars, which is that it's not possible to kind of draw a clear and obvious line from historical ideas to the present. The line is more meandering and interwoven with other themes, you know, disability, with race, with other aspects, with gender and other aspects as well. So I mean, I do have one question here, which is that in some ways, that in both the cases of immigration and disability, race and disability, there's what people would produce as a sort of logical rationale for doing it, the economic burden or the inability to work or something like that. But it also seemed to be underpinned by an irrational his hostility, fear, desire for an unreachable purity of the community and things like that. But the balance is kind of different with disability, I think, and with other aspects. So that's a very long-winded way of passing this question, which is, what would you actually say to those people watching your presentation who would say, well, sure, yeah, why not keep people with disability out? Because after all, they're not contributing anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common, yeah, I mean, that's why it's been in law for as long as it has, or if maybe not explicitly law, through regulation and technologies that govern immigration. What would I say? Well, one thing I think is, first of all, just the whole notion of contribution through economic value. People bring more than their productivity and their economic value to society. So, I mean, that's the, the whole capitalist idea of, productive bodies and the kind of values that we need to, our contribution, I think, is an area that really needs, and many disability advocates and activists are doing this in Australia and across the world. They're trying to dismantle this dominant notion of contribution based on productive outcomes. In some ways it's a similar argument to women, where we have to remember there was a time in history where women's labour in the household wasn't given value either. But, we've begun to understand the value of different types of bodies, and what does contribution actually mean. People with disabilities do contribute. And with the NDIS, if we think about the NDIS, I mean, people can say, well, they're not. Actually, as Greg Hunt once quoted, when he was, the NDIS is Australia's largest economic employment program since the Second World War. So, depending on what side of politics you're falling, you're conceptualizing ideas of contribution quite differently. But even the right have recently taken up the notion that disability is generating economic value through the NDIS, which it is. But besides that, I think, it's really about feminist notions of care and how we begin to deconstruct relationships of care and trust and well-being. I mean, the other issue too is, historically, what we know is people have to make terrible decisions. Is the other thing, is the kind of pain and trauma that the Australian immigration system has actually caused within families, where people have left family members offshore because they've wanted other family members to come. So, I mean, I think ultimately those kind of frameworks is not, it's not just about contribution, it's really about the bigger ethical question about the kind of society we want to be and the kinds of communities we want to create and the kinds of values that we generate when we start stratifying bodies based on largely abstract economic values of contribution.
Okay.
I think that's a long-winded answer
to a long-winded question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
We have time possibly, I think, for one more question, which is possibly an easier one to respond to, which is I'm asked, what are the definitions of disability that are used in immigration policy? What gets covered, I think, is what's meant here. What gets covered by the term disability? Is it defined in some way? And have the definitions changed from some of those examples, the older example you were showing us?
Yeah, so they have actually they have changed in terms of now they've gone to functional diagnoses. So thinking about diagnostic labels, much like we have, you know, in the disability support pension, where we have criteria around labels and then functionality about what a person can do. It's quite a similar aspect in migration because really because they are looking for you know, this notion of how much you're going to cost or how much of a burden you are on the state. And it's costed between, you know, the maximum. So children are particularly disadvantaged. So we can also begin to understand how this really impacts on family migration. You know, I hate this language, but a person's value is costed at maximum of 49,000 across their life course, you know. But what they're using there is they're using categories, so diagnostic categories, and they're measuring notions of functionality and the kinds, and then they're assessing that against the kind of supports they're suggesting you actually need. And you know, we know that we know from numerous cases that they don't often get this correct. And I've been working with, I have a PhD student from the University of Deusto, which is in Spain, and she's been doing some work, Carla Bruno Urbani, and she's been doing work looking at the data around this. And when you start pulling out the data in detail for cases that you're able to have access to where the minister has overridden, you know, what's one of the key things that people will be doing is using counter or different kind of frameworks to speak back to that highly medicalised notion of functionality and disability and productivity and contribution. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. I think we're actually out of time now, so I'm going to wind up. Thank everybody for attending. Thank, of course, Karen for presenting. Thank our interpreters for interpreting for us. And I'd like to draw your attention to the next in this series of webinars, which should be in 2 weeks' time, but keep your eye open for an announcement about that. And of course, you can always find out more by subscribing to our newsletter at disabilityinnovation, all one word, .unsw.edu.au. Thank you for joining us this afternoon and have a good day.